It was during the second half of the 19th century that baseball became popularly known as America's national pastime. It also became one of the most stringently segregated of sports, its governing bodies instituting a colour and gender bar, developing the game at the elite level exclusively for players who were white and male. The gradual move towards racial integration and the dismantling of the Negro Leagues in the mid-20th century has justifiably attracted considerable academic and popular attention. Far less well known is the story of women's baseball, whose players, apart from a brief period between 1943 and 1954, to this day have never been granted their own professional league and have instead been forced to settle for the game's underarm equivalent, softball. It is perhaps unsurprising that it was in baseball's formative years, when thousands of teams proliferated across the United States beneath a comparatively decentralized system, that female baseballers should have enjoyed their greatest chance to flourish. Women took up the game in the 1850s and 60s as eagerly as men, and the first women's baseball game, for which fans were charged and players paid, was played in Springfield, Illinois in 1875 between the blondes and brunettes, literally two teams of young women separated by hair colour, with the blondes triumphing 42-38 before a crowd of over 200 spectators, with the players receiving the muted praise that everything was done decently and in order, and there was nothing, save perhaps the exhibition of female anatomy, to which exception could be taken. By the 1880s, women's baseball was drawing 1,500-strong crowds, and the gimmickry of the early blondes versus brunettes exhibitions had been replaced by genuinely competitive matches between bona fide women's teams, dubbed Bloomer Girls, for their risque, tight-fitting trousers. Arguably, the greatest female player of baseball's silver age in the very early 20th century was the now almost entirely forgotten Maud Nelson. Maud was born Clementina Breda to Italian parents in a Tyrolean village under Austrian Habsburg rule in 1881. The region boasted a significant Italian population, and the Habsburg presence was hotly contested by the newly formed Italian state. Caught up in these political tumults, Clementina's parents chose to join millions of other Italians in emigrating to the United States. Little is known of Clementina's early childhood, although her rapid assimilation into American society was underscored not only by her fledgling baseball prowess, but by the fact that already by her adolescence she had changed her name to the much more American-sounding Maud Nelson. Maud first came to public attention in 1897, when, at the age of 15, she became the starting pitcher for the Boston Bloomer Girls, one of the foremost women's teams in the country. The Boston Bloomers travelled up and down the east coast of the United States, and sometimes farther afield, taking on women's teams, and very provocatively, the occasional men's team. Before long, Maud had established herself as her team's major drawcard, singled out wherever she played for her abundant skill on the mound and at third base. Indeed, so popular did she become that she was rarely relieved of her pitching duties, whilst her pitching itself was favourably compared to the leading male players of the era. Whilst the Bloomers as a team often found themselves on the receiving end of derisive commentary and intense moral outrage from contemporary baseball reporters, in equal parts bemused and aghast at women wearing trousers and playing what they considered to be a man's game, these same writers rarely had a bad word to say about Maud's performances. She was described in contemporary matchday reports as clever, an expert, thoroughly professional, and capable of striking out male batters with her puzzling curveball. The Anaconda Standard declared that she threw the ball like a man, whilst the Arizona Republic enthused over her standard of play via the ultimate backhanded compliment, declaring that she was better than it would ever be supposed any woman could ever become. Sadly, these kinds of regional circuits were as far as female ball players could go at the turn of the century, and after 11 years touring with the Bloomers, Maud moved on to become the starting pitcher for the Cherokee Indian Baseball Club. 3 years later, in 1911, she met and married John Olson, manager of the Western Bloomer Girls, and announced her retirement at the age of 30 to take up a position as manager of her husband's team. Segueing into coaching and administration, Maud developed a reputation as an elite talent scout, so much so that men's teams even hired her as a recruiter. After her husband's death in 1917, Maud briefly returned to play for the Boston Bloomer Girls before remarrying and starting up her own successful women's team, the All-Star Ranger Girls. Sadly, the Great Depression killed off the Ranger Girls, and Maud retired from baseball altogether after almost 40 years in the sport. By the time she died, in February 1944, it must have been a comfort to her, though likely also a source of personal frustration, that a professional women's league, memorialised in the Gina Davis-Tom Hanks film A League of Their Own, had at last, albeit fleetingly as it turned out, come into existence. If you enjoyed this content, I'd recommend checking out my new book, Hollywood's Women of Action, From the Perils of Pauline to Wonder Woman, which examines the development of the action heroine as a character from the silent screen era to the present day. It's available from Amazon and other international booksellers. To purchase, follow the link in the description below. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.